and good afternoon. It's great to be here, and it's been an amazing couple of days. We are now, I think, well, this is 3 sessions from the end, so I don't want to suggest you guys want to go home just yet, but not long to go if you're finding it hard going. And actually, it's a great turnout for the third from last session on a second day of a very packed agenda. So I'm full of admiration for you and the speakers and the moderators that we've had so far. Now, one of the things about having so many panels to sit and watch is that you can get a good idea of excellent speaker styles, great moderation. My style, I think, is going to be a little bit hands-off. I'm not going to make this into a micro-debate. This is going to be an opportunity for the speakers to tell us where they're coming from on the issues in question, give us their perspectives. And I think that's important because we have actually a very diverse panel here. Let me introduce them to you. You can see the lineup in front of you, but on the outside right here, I didn't say far right, Andreas Graf from FIFA. He is the human rights manager. On the left side, maybe the far left, is Lene Wendland, who is the chief in the UN Human Rights Department. I think you're responsible for business and human rights, right? To Lene's right is Courtney Radsch, who's from the Committee to Protect Journalists. And on my right is Maryam Shojaei from the organization By Fundamental Right, who've been working on issues in Iran. Let's start with Lene, because I think what we want to do firstly is to set out the landscape a little bit. Many of us here, I think, see ourselves as human rights defenders, activists, people who protect the rights of individuals to raise issues of concern. And I guess from you, it would be great to hear about what the general framework is, both at an international level and also within sport, or some of your thoughts about how we can approach this in sport.
Thank you very much, Piera. And can I just say that was a very good save on the whole left-right thing. So congratulations on that. Yes, I'm just going to set out very briefly, speak to some of the international standards that are relevant to the topic of this panel. And obviously, like everything, it goes back to the Universal Declaration, but I won't bang on about that today. I did enough of that last night. So I do want to just, apart from saying a few just on the Universal Declaration, obviously freedom of expression, freedom of participation, privacy, dignity, non-discrimination are all essential concepts to the discussion that we'll be having in this panel. But there is another anniversary that we're celebrating this year. It's the 20th anniversary of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Human Rights Defenders, which is an important document. It's a declaration, not a legally binding instrument in that sense, but it has had a significant impact on the kind of discussions and on the understanding of the role of human rights defenders as we understand it at the international level. And basically, the declaration talks about everyone's right individually or in association with others to promote or strive for the protection and realization of human rights. So a really important baseline document that sets the frame for what it is we're talking about that is of such central importance to human rights. It doesn't contain a specific finite definition of who are the individuals or acting individually or in association we're talking about, which is a good thing. It's a very expansive understanding, and I think that we need to have that. It's not a only one person can say, I am a human rights defender, you're not. It has its own risks, but I think for the purpose of our discussion, it's very important to keep that expansion notion of what it is we're talking about. It ranges from international organizations, trade unions, communities and representatives within communities, journalists, obviously, civil servants, athletes, private sector actors as well, can come under the banner of human rights defenders in the understanding that we are having. Obviously, the reason why we're here is a very collective shared belief that sport and human rights have something to say to each other, and that the sport can be such a powerful platform for advancing, arguing, promoting social change, justice, and we've seen that, I mean, for over many specific occasions, 1968 Olympics, but we have many more, much more recent examples that we will hear about, including on this panel. But I do want to flag, and I think it is important not to forget that for human rights defenders, it does require an enabling environment, and that environment starts with the role of the state in protecting that environment and advancing the rights of those who use and seize their right to advocate for social change, social justice, whatever the case may be, that are linked to human rights. And we have a real problem in that regard, because civic space is shrinking. The space in which human rights defenders, journalists, etc., are operating is under very significant threat. Has never been totally unthreatened, let me put it that way, but we are certainly in the last few years, in basically all corners of the world, we are seeing a sustained attack, whether through legal means, so requiring NGOs, for example, to register as foreign agents if they get support from abroad in terms of funding, through much more direct and much more overt or covert persecution. And I think that is, when we're talking the discussion we're having today, we're focusing a lot, obviously, on athletes and all the actors involved in sport and sports governing bodies. But I do think that we should never forget that fundamentally human rights are very much about governments, and what we are seeing is a very widespread attack on these values, led by governments. Governments have the duty to protect, but in fact are amongst the main culprits, the main failures when it comes to human rights defenders, and ensuring that we are living up to the aspirations in both the Universal Declaration and in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Human Rights Defenders. That, of course, often happens, those failures happens with the explicit or implicit support by other actors. It can be business enterprises or indeed sports organizations at different levels. But again, I do just want to remind us that when we're having these discussions, it can sometimes be a little bit maybe easy or convenient to forget that there are states that really need to be much more part and center. I'm very happy that there are a number of states that are involved in the Center for Sport and Human Rights. But we obviously need to be concerned about those who don't want to come and be part of these discussions. So as for the role of others, of course, we have the UN Guiding Principles, and I'm aware I'm probably already way over time, so you just give me whatever card you want to give me. And of course, the human rights due diligence requirements of actors, we know sports governing bodies, obviously business enterprises in their own right, the responsibility of those actors of doing human rights due diligence that would and does require also assessing what are the risks for their various activities and engagement when it comes to protection of human rights defenders in that most expansive understanding. And so we have we'll hear Andreas speaking in a moment, but there are obviously the human rights requirements that sports governing bodies can put into bidding, but also monitoring and staging, those that are staging and hosting games. We've talked about the role of sponsors, but there are also suppliers and others. The issue of human rights defenders is everywhere through a supply chain of sport, be it from the big events or down to the local level. So there are very clear standards. There's very clear guidance that governs the space, and obviously implementation, as ever, is the challenge, but we should never proceed on the understanding that this isn't something that the responsibilities cascade down to every level and through any actor that is involved in sport. We've seen, and I'll end on that, that obviously those same organizations who have responsibilities under the UNGPs to do human rights due diligence, to identify and mitigate risks, also, and should really be applauded for taking a more proactive stance in terms of speaking out, in terms of standing up for the rights of human rights defenders in sports and outside. Sport obviously is a mirror of the various societies in which sport events take place. And I think, of course, in this space, that it's very clear and has been from the beginning of the discussions about the Centre, that this is one of the core issues, the core roles that the Centre can play, to be a voice and collate those who want to stand up for the rights of human rights defenders, and find practical ways of doing that is a key role. But I also do want to, my very final remark, and that's not specifically related to sport, but the landmark statement that was issued by a number of global companies on Human Rights Day, standing up specifically for civic freedoms, human rights defenders, and the rule of law. And I do want to congratulate the companies that were taking that leadership position in terms of really recognize the role that companies have, not just in terms of their own due diligence and in terms of ensuring that that they themselves are not involved with abuse of human rights defenders, but really being proactively speaking up that these are core values when it comes to human rights in any society around the world, and these are values that are under threat and needs to be defended. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lene. Now, I want to hear now from a real-life human defender, Maryam, Shojaei. He's from the My Fundamental Right organization, and you and a sister organization, Open Stadiums, have been working in Iran to open up access to football stadiums for women. Can you tell us, give an overview very quickly of the issues that you face, so that everybody here understands really where we're at? Yeah.
Okay. As many of you know, for the past 4 decades, Iranian women were not allowed to go to stadium watching games. This is not a law, it's a rule, and this is something that happened gradually after 1979 revolutions. So the country was in a chaos, and there was no game, and then it was war. So step by step, women disappeared from a stadium, and it has been a long time that several grassroots organization has been working on it, and we're still working on it.
So basically, women are just banned from stadiums. Yeah. There have been some recent developments. Can you tell us about those?
I'm not sure if that, I don't call it development, but yeah, because of the pressure, outside pressure, the Iranian Federation pretended that there are some women inside the stadium, but this is not the case. They don't even sell one ticket to women. So if you're a female and you want to buy a ticket, you're not allowed to do that.
And the stories we saw recently about a small number of women being allowed into a game recently, was that, what's the situation there?
You're fast forwarding,
okay.
Because as I said, because there were pressure from outside, and they were threatened to be excluded from the board, to be able to host the game. They have to let women inside. So, but the main stadium in Tehran, the capacity is 100,000. So the last game, when both Mr. Infantino, head of FIFA, and Mr. Sheikh Salman from AFC, both of them were there, and from 100,000 seats, only 800 was for women, and no ticket. They were like relatives of players or relatives of federation workers. So, there were other girls waiting outside of the stadium, and I don't call it like, as you said, improvement. It's like, it's a kind of seducing foreigners to get away.
So that was just a gesture. There's no open tickets just for people to, it's the veneer that we're moving somewhere when in fact they're not, right?
Exactly.
And as you say, this is not a decree or a government law. This is something that the Football Association of Iran itself imposes on football.
No, actually it's not, because as I said, that ban never publicly announced. It wasn't a day that somebody come and said, like, from tomorrow women are not allowed to go. As I said, because there wasn't any game at the beginning of like 2-3 years of the revolution, and then there was war. So step by step, because of so many limitation for women, like mandatory hijab and everything, that happened little by little. So no, it's not a law. So that's why we're very optimistic we can change it.
Okay. Now, what about the sort of work that you're doing? How are you raising awareness of this? How are you putting pressure on the authorities to allow women in, effectively, to sell those tickets?
Actually, personally, I passed that stage, because when I started my campaign, it was because of the connection I had. I had a relative who's a soccer player, and I worked in cinema, so I had so many celebrities friends. I decided to start it because the main reason was I wanted to raise awareness, because when something becomes like for a long time exists, as a kid, as a teenager, I never even questioned why I cannot go to a stadium. You know, it was very, thank you. It was a really normal. If you're a female, of course you're not going to a stadium, you know. But before me, many activists started that and worked on it. But I wanted to take leverage of the connection that I have by raising awareness and asking those people to mention these things over and over. So that's because it was a taboo talking about these things before. But these days it's like everybody, after any game, celebrities with like million followers, they said, oh, that was really bad that our women were not able. We're going to work up how bad is our women are not able to go to stadiums. So
it's on the agenda through the work that you've been doing, and you started a petition.
Yes.
Tell us a little about the petition, how many signatures you had, who was it presented to?
I started the petition November 2014, and then it was deactivated for a while. And then recently, by help of the Equality League, be activated, and it it has more than 200,000 signatures, which I delivered it to Ms. Samura, the Security Council of FIFA, and.
Okay, so you had more than 200,000 signatures. Through your campaigning work, there's awareness in Iran about this issue. People are tweeting about it on social media after matches, and you've approached FIFA directly. What was the response from FIFA to the pressure that you've been applying? How did that meeting go?
Actually, Mr. Graf was
We'll come to him in a minute, don't worry.
And they're very cooperative. They were very nice, welcoming. But something that really disappointed me was the meeting was 2 days before the last game that we had in Iran, one of the Iranian against one of the Japanese. It was a Asian League final. Mm-hmm. And I explained in details that they're going to play the show because they know that they have to pay the price. They have to face the consequences. Mm-hmm. So if you see some women inside the stadium, it's a show. My friends are asking to go there because they gave them ticket because they were journalists or they were activists. So, but for the 8 hours, my meeting was on a Thursday and Saturday when the game took place. I saw, as I said, both AFC and FIFA's head were there. And I saw a statement from Mr. Infantino on FIFA saying, congratulating Iranian authorities to keep their words. And that really bothered me and bothered many Iranians because they know that was a game and they know how Iranians were able to sell it. The only thing that surprised me was my explanation and in details that this show is going to happen.
Okay, so you felt that the statement that FIFA made welcoming progress by the Iranian FA wasn't justified. They didn't actually sell any tickets, so that was premature of the FIFA president to welcome it.
Yes, I mean, it has been 40 years that even one ticket wasn't sold for female.
Okay, now that's the issue. What about yourself as an activist, as someone who's pushing for this issue? Have there been any repercussions for you in Iran, outside? Have the authorities tried to silence your voice, to tell you not to do this? You're bringing embarrassment, anything like that?
This issue has so many activists. If they want to limit it, people, they have to limit it 40 million Iranian, and not only Iranian women, our man, very supportive. There was a game inside Iran, big stadium, half of the population man, they said, woman has to, the other side that been to a stadium, you know, they are very, if they want to have a reaction for me, it's not only me, and I am not the only one. So many women and men, of course, but women in like organized way was very active about the issue. Many of them. I have a friend, her leg was broken because she didn't want to leave the stadium. It was actually like 12, 13 years ago. So each young lady, many women that they're going outside of the stadium, they are the real activists. It's easy to come here, talking to like so many lovely people. It's not difficult, you know, they face risk. The women that they're going, especially these days, so many of them disguised as guys in order to get into stadium. These days, they put some police women. So when they are not sure, maybe he's a woman, they search their body to make sure that she's a female, you know.
Okay.
I don't take credit for what I do because, as I said,
You're part of a wider movement. There's a lot of wide support. Okay, thank you for that. Andreas, can we talk about FIFA and its policy, the mechanism that you have to defend human rights activists and journalists, I guess particularly if they're raising concerns of the kind that Maryam is, or also perhaps in the run-up to mega events, exposing malpractice, and so on and so forth. Let's talk about that mechanism first before any sort of responses that you might have to the situation in Iran.
Well, thank you very much. It's obviously not very easy to start after such a powerful intervention from Maryam. I'll afterwards say a couple of words on what FIFA does to address this case. I'm obviously myself closely involved in FIFA steps around this topic. But let me first, thank you for inviting me to speak on this panel. I'm very happy in particular to speak on this panel around human rights defenders. It's a topic that is very dear to me personally. Before I joined FIFA a bit more than 2 years ago, I was working for a peace-building organization, and I had the privilege to work with a lot of individuals in different contexts around the world who go at great risks to defend the rights of their communities, to seek peace for their communities, and I've always been impressed by the courage and the sacrifice these people are going through. So when a bit more than 2.5 years ago, we started systematizing FIFA's work around human rights, and we've heard a lot around this over the past couple of days or 2 days. it was very clear from the beginning that we wanted to have one focus of their work on human rights defenders. There's a personal component to it, but there's clearly also recognition from the organization itself that it is the right thing to do. And I'd say for two reasons. Reason one, we do our human rights due diligence, and human rights defenders and journalists are groups that are at particular risks linked to our activities. So it's pretty straightforward that we need to develop our own mechanisms, our own processes around the need to respect and help protect the rights of human rights defenders. This is true for mega sporting events, but it's also true for our work we are doing in the broader space of football. And it was in particular true about a year ago in the lead up to the World Cup in Russia when we were developing these mechanisms. So that was reason number one. And reason number two is well, if we are really serious about our human rights commitment and our human rights risks are spread around the world, we need people who bring up cases to our attention, who help us understand our human rights risks. How do we want from Zurich, centralized, try to understand what is going on around the world? So human rights defenders in so many ways are natural allies for us as an organization in implementing our human rights commitments. Now, Federico Diecchi, yesterday morning, head of our department, said that FIFA has become part of the solution on human rights issues, and I think it's particularly the case with regards to human rights defenders. And let me speak about a couple of key steps that we put in place over the past a bit more than a year in that respect. Well, first, we developed a policy framework. We integrated an article or a paragraph number 11 in the human rights policy, which focuses on the rights of human rights defenders and what we are committed to do to respect and help protect human rights defenders. You will see Article 11 or paragraph 11 in the human rights policy is not a salient human rights area, but it's a cross-cutting issue, a work area we see throughout all of our human rights work we put in the center of this work. So that was very important for us from the very beginning in the policy to have human rights defenders highlighted. We then developed a more specific policy statement around human rights defenders and journalists, which we released in May this year. We developed it together with an organization that specializes on the support of human rights defenders around the world and consulted many of you here in the room in the development of that policy. And let me share my thanks for your support, not only for this consultation process, but for the number of consultations processes we have run through you over the past a bit more than a year. So the policy framework I think it's really important. I come back to that afterwards when we speak about the impact. It sets the expectation towards the inside, but it also sets the expectation towards the outside. And it allows us to have something in hand when we go to third parties. And oftentimes we are linked to human rights risks around human rights defense and journalists through our relationship with third parties. It allows us to have something in the hand, something to point to when we go and speak to be it governments, be it member associations, be it companies we're working with. So that's the policy framework. We then put in place a number of mechanisms to learn about the human rights risks associated with our work that link to human rights defenders. One key element of it is the complaints mechanism, which is a web-based tool which we launched end of May. Which at a high level allows human rights defenders to bring complaints to our attention and through a secure communication with us then for us to try to address those issues. So we've been running this complaints mechanism over the past months. I'm happy to share a bit more in the Q&A session if that is of interest. You will also see some information on this in the recent Human Rights Advisory Board report that was published I think about a month ago on specific cases there. So the complaints mechanism is one thing. Then we integrate human rights defenders and journalists as a rights holder group in all the human rights impact or salience assessments we are doing. It was strongly highlighted in the requirements for the 2026 FIFA World Cup and is also highlighted in all the other requirements for the future tournaments. So I'd encourage you to go and read the strategy that Maryam and the team put together, which includes a very strong section around the topic of human rights defenders. And also, we look at human rights defenders as a rights holder group in the development of the sustainability strategy for the 2022 World Cup in Qatar. The strategy is about to be finalized and will be launched early next year, and also includes a section on this topic. And then a third way, and probably the most important way through which we learn about risks and about cases that are attached to those risks in association with our activities, is really the engagement with civil society organizations. I believe we have stepped up our engagement with many of you here in the room quite drastically over the past months. And if there's one lesson to be learned from Russia in that space, it is really that of all the cases we have addressed around Russia, in the lead up to Russia, we were first made aware either through journalists who wrote about them or through human rights organizations we were in touch with. So that has really been one of it's good to have the complaints mechanism, but it's even more important to have the connections, the eyes and ears on the ground of people for us to intervene as fast as possible. So policy framework, how do we identify, how do we learn about risks? And then the third area, well, how do we actually address human rights, cases of violations for human rights defenders when they come up? Over the past months, we have addressed about, or we were involved in addressing about 20 cases of human rights defenders, and we took a number of steps in that respect. A first set of measures is engaging with government authorities, oftentimes the host governments we're dealing with, in a preventative manner, to flag the issue, to set our expectations. That's where the policy comes in, and which is really helpful. And we are quite confident that the engagement we had at a very high level with our Russian counterparts in the lead up to the tournament was an important factor for a tournament which was in which there was a lot of civic space in the country which is normally not there. So that was one thing. The second thing is intervening directly with authorities when a specific case comes up. We set up a mechanism in Russia together with our security department. They sit basically in a situation room together with different security authorities of the host country, where they address all sorts of security-related topics. So we had a lot of discussions with our colleagues, and you can imagine it's not the first thing a traditional security person thinks about when he speaks about security, to think about human rights and human rights defenders. So we got very good allies in our security department, and were able to address a bit more than a handful of cases through those mechanisms. We spoke out regularly in support of human rights defenders, either publicly through public statements, through letters, but also in one case by attending a court case of Semyon Simonov, and many of you will remember last year his moving testimony in Geneva at the Sporting Chance Forum. I believe it was an important sign for FIFA to say we care about his situation, we care about the topic more broadly, and well, we had an excellent collaboration with Minky and the team from Human Rights Watch around this specific case. And then there's a set of issues that we can address through our own processes. There were a number of cases that came up in relation to our accreditation process for the 2018 FIFA World Cup, where essentially member associations nominate their journalists for the accreditation. And that's then more easy for us because we can give the accreditation to whomever we want, we as FIFA, so we can circumvent that process if need be. A couple of final thoughts on impact. Well, 3 points really. First, I believe it's important to say we were not successful in all of the cases, and we are not successful in all of the cases. There were cases where we think we did what we could, and we were not successful. We were not able to bring the leverage to the table that we would have had to. And it's sometimes quite difficult to see that before intervening in a case, whether you actually have the leverage or not. Sometimes it's one example is a very small case. It would have been easy for a third party to just send an apology to this journalist, and it would have been done. But even us as FIFA, we were not able to bring the leverage to the table for this to be done in the end. And in other situations, well, we believe we were able to really bring about important change or help bring about important change for specific individuals. We saw court cases that looked very serious at the beginning being reduced to small administrative fines. We saw visas being given for journalists whose visas were blocked before. We ourselves gave accreditation to people who were somehow blocked through the system. I'm wrapping up. And we saw a number of human rights defenders who faced a lot of reprisals going into the process and being able to conduct their work in at least a much freer environment as possible. So let me stop here. I'd be happy to take any questions and then also to say a word or two on the case in Iran. Thank you very much.
Okay, so that's important because we haven't formally had a session over the last 2 days to review the last sporting mega event that we've had. It was the World Cup, so it was useful to hear about what you had in place. So people can go to the report of the Human Rights Advisory Group that you have to find out the numbers that use the mechanism during Russia over the summer. That's all reported on publicly.
Exactly. We included quite a number of information in that report, in Part B.
Could just one thing in terms of leverage. I've got people already queuing up to ask questions, but we're going to hear from Courtney in a minute. Do you have an internal assessment as to when the mechanism is activated in the run-up to or during a World Cup in your case, when that leverage fades away? Because there's no point you on the final day raising a big issue with the Russian authorities because really they've finished, they're getting ready to clear up. You have no leverage left at all.
Yeah, I think that's one of the one of the key lessons learned from us having implemented this mechanism and on all of those activities for the first time. Well, we felt we had a lot of leverage early on in the tournament. There was a lot of responsiveness on the sides of actors you would not imagine that they would be responsive around those topics. And we were able to fix a number of cases really in the first half, first two-thirds of the tournament. That leverage decreased towards the end. So if we take the case of the Pussy Riot activists who ran on the pitch in the final, there's a marked difference in terms of the responsiveness we had on this case on our intervention when compared to some of the early cases very early on in the tournament. And then maybe another one on leverage. I think what we try to be very strategic about is including leverage not only during the tournament, but really in the early phase, on the bidding phase of the tournament, going into selection and then going into strategy development. I think Mary made a couple of very good points around that on the previous panel.
Okay, and then could you please, because we're going to get questions, address the issue, the latest issue from your perspective, FIFA, in terms of the stadium, effectively a stadium ban for women in Iran. What's the update from you?
Yeah. Well, number one,
what is FIFA doing actually to force the FA to overturn the ban? That's the question, really.
Yeah. Well, let me first say there should be no doubt that for FIFA, we're fully committed to help bringing about an end to this ban. We have been public about this for several times. FIFA president has been speaking out about this. We are actively working on this. I think there are a number of steps, and you've asked about concrete steps in that respect. So there was the FIFA president when he started his tenure 3 years ago. The issue of the stadium ban for women, both in Saudi Arabia and Iran, was an important topic to him. He went to Tehran in early March this year. He brought it up as as one of the key elements to discuss. He got the commitment from the president of Iran that there would be important progress, or there would be progress in this matter coming soon. We quickly published this because we found that it is an important commitment to be out there also for people to work with. And there is a continued engagement at the level of the FIFA president and his office with Iranian counterparts. Secondly, we spoke out in support of Maryam and her colleagues immediately after the meeting, because there were quite severe incidents happening around that meeting and the match that President Infantino attended. in support of them, condemning the reprisals that have taken place. And Maryam has mentioned the recent meeting they had with the FIFA Secretary General around this topic. So there is a genuine interest or a genuine effort on FIFA's side to support Maryam and her colleagues in their work. During the World Cup, many of you will have seen the different articles with the banner in the stadium, which calls for an end to the stadium ban in Iran. It would be too long to explain the whole work surrounding this effort, but I could just say that we went out of our way to make sure that this was possible in a very difficult context and with a lot of pushback at various levels.
That's good, I think. Thank you very much. Because I need to move on to Courtney, really, and to hear from, it sinks in quite nicely, actually, but about your mechanism. Now we're going to hear from Courtney, who is from the Committee to Protect Journalists, in terms of the risks that journalists face in reporting some of the abuses that we have discussed over the last couple of days. And if there's specific references you can make to sport, football in particular, to reference back to Andreas, then that would be really good.
Sure. So I think we're getting a little tired. It's late in the afternoon. So if you have ever reached out to a journalist to cover your issue, you wanted to do a campaign, if you wanted to tell your story as an affected athlete or a fan, can you just stand up? Let's get a little energy here. Can you stand up if you've ever had to use a journalist to get your story out, or have been contacted by a journalist who's trying to report about labor violations in a country? Okay, great. So we can see that this issue of journalists, it's not just about journalists. So you can go ahead and sit down. If you didn't sit down, go ahead and wave your hands just to wake up a little bit. My point in doing this is that the protection of journalists in the issue of sport affects all of the other affected groups as well. So journalists are most often, it's not just about the days in which the games take place. And, you know, Iran is a good example where we saw during, not only were the women banned from going into the stadium, but the women journalists trying to cover that were also banned from going into the stadium. But it's not just the coverage of the games that is important. And it's important that this mechanism that has been set up by FIFA and the one set up by the Olympic Committee, the OIC, cover the entire staging of the games. Because actually what we know is that it's oftentimes the journalists who are trying to cover, you know, the deaths of laborers in Qatar building the stadium who are facing repercussions. It's the local journalists reporting on the corruption around, you know, in Ghana, around games that are being staged there, or about in Sochi around the environmental degradation and the corruption. So this is all integrated. It is reporters reporting on LGBT issues in countries where that is not acceptable. So I think that we have to look at this as a double threat, because it impacts obviously on these individuals as their own human rights, but also on the rights of others and the ability to tell those stories. And just to give you a sense of the scope of this, so since 1992, when we started keeping records of journalists killed, 35 of the 1,331 journalists killed covered sports. 18 of those were murdered. That means they were murdered because of their journalism covering this. And we just released our annual prison census of journalists in jail today. 39 of the 251 journalists in prison for their work were working in sports or did some sort of sports coverage, and 2 to 3 of those arrests are directly related to their sports reporting. And of course, it's impossible to quantify the number of threats, harassment, surveillance, visa restrictions, visa denials, detentions, etc., that goes along that journalists face reporting on these issues. And the impact is not only in terms of this, you know, official repression that can come from the state, but it can also lead to self-censorship, which might mean that if you are an activist working on behalf of child's rights, you might not be able to get your story out if you can't bring the journalists in to see that issue. So this, you know, or you might not have journalists who are willing to take the risks to cover corruption. Corruption is one of the most dangerous beats to cover as a journalist. And I think it's very important, this, the existence of these mechanisms. It's a great first step, and it's definitely a best principle that I think all major sporting events should take, and all of the hosting governments. So Japan is here, Qatar is here. You have a responsibility to make sure that journalists know about the mechanism. So both FIFA needs to have a better plan, and we've talked about this, and I think they're working on this. The OIC absolutely needs a better plan, because right now it's sitting on its laurels for having created a mechanism, but it hasn't really told anyone about it since it created it the day before the Olympics started. So we need to make sure that this is communicated to journalists, to human rights activists, to the organizations working with those affected groups, so that they can use it, and that they can use it in the years leading up to the games. Because we know, for example, in China and in Russia, which were both hosts of these, major sporting events, there were massive human rights violations and massive violations against journalists. In the 100 days leading up to the Olympics in China, the local Foreign Correspondents Club reported that at least 10 correspondents received anonymous death threats, more than 50 incidents of official interference in reporting in Tibet. And so let's think about this. China will be a host of the Olympics. We know that they have already been overseeing a massive crackdown on the Uyghur population, where they are all under surveillance, and now they are once again the second leading jailer of journalists. Almost all of the new cases are Uyghurs. I anticipate that we are going to see that be an issue around the staging of the Olympic Games. It's going to be very hard to cover those issues, so we need to get that mechanism working and publicized out there. And it is mainly, I would say, mega sporting events, but we also see it at more local level sporting events. So, for example, in Ghana, an investigative film crew got death threats, harassment. They were surveilled because they were reporting on corruption in football in Ghana. And as you heard during my question during the last session, there is a big issue with the harassment of women journalists who are covering sports, both in terms of these games that we're talking about here, but also sport in general. So I think many of you probably saw or heard about the women journalists who were literally assaulted on camera and harassed during the World Cup. In Brazil, there was a campaign called I don't know how to speak Portuguese, but basically Let Her Do Her Job. And it was all about these, the abuses that these journalists are facing from fans, from other reporters, from the mascot in one case of a team. And so I think that is something I'd love to see, to preempt maybe a question that's going to come later, us to discuss next year, is how do we get ahead of that? And I think we touched a little bit on gender, but I think we should really have a more focused discussion about that going forward, because it's an issue, I think, across many of these, across sport. The accountability mechanisms are interesting and important, and we need to ask the OIC to have a plan and a strategy on human rights, and also on how to get the press freedom reporting mechanism publicized. And it's great that FIFA has voluntarily, and I know that you guys did a lot of consultations and you took our suggestions that you do transparency reporting, which is really important. The fact that they put out a report so we can know what incidents were reported, what is the status, that's a best practice. I'd like to see the OIC adopt that, and any other mechanisms. Also, redundancy. So one of the good things about the OIC mechanism is it's set up and it specifically says that they encourage that whoever is reporting a violation to also report it to an independent NGO. So like the Committee to Protect Journalists or another NGO that they feel comfortable reaching out to, because then that allows us to do our due diligence and to follow up, so that we're not waiting until after the fact to see if anything was done. We are also, just as an organization, we have seen that, these, as Mary alluded to, these sporting events can be dangerous for journalists because of the environment in which they're taking place, for example, because of protests. So we put out safety alerts on these for example, how to cover FIFA World Cup. Is it because of protests? Maybe journalists could be facing surveillance, for example. That was a big issue in Russia, the digital security. And frankly, that's not only an issue for journalists, but I would have all of you guys think about, if you're going into a country such as China or Russia, but frankly Saudi Arabia, that has significant surveillance to really secure your digital devices, because if you are working with human rights activists or you're working with any vulnerable populations, if you don't practice good digital security hygiene, you're going to end up putting those people potentially at risk. So, I think that it's really important that we are talking about, human rights activists and journalists, and we need to think about, okay, well, how do we get that information out? And so I would also encourage broadcasters. I think that they have a really important role to play in making sure that the broadcasters know that these mechanisms exist and that they're communicating that to their staff and then to their local fixers, their local translators. We also document violations against media workers. So a lot of the local staff are at the utmost risk. The vast majority of journalists who are killed and imprisoned for their work are local journalists. And those are the people that the international crews are hiring to help with translation, help getting sources, et cetera. So we want to think about how can broadcasters as a particular group be proactive in making sure that these mechanisms are used and that the right safety and security advice is given out to reporters. And do you want to ask a question?
No,
yeah.
I just wanted
okay.
to try to get some questions in.
Sure.
Yeah?
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, yeah.
Thanks, Courtney. Thanks for the injection of energy as well. Now, I can tell the organisers I'm going to nick some time. I can tell you right now, because we're out time, 5 minutes for questions. I'm not sure it'll be enough, but please, if you want to ask a question, raise your hand. And let's have some questions spread around for the panel, not just for FIFA. So I had one here from Mary, from Minky. Federico, have you got a question, or are you going to redress something? Okay. Can I come back to you then in a second? So Mary, Minky, one here, two. That's what, 4 or 5 questions plus Federico. Let's kick off with Mary.
Yeah, just real quick, and I do apologize, it is a FIFA question. When it comes to the stadium ban for women, what has FIFA mapped out what it feels are its sources of leverage to bring to bear on this particular issue? So there's sort of a way of how do you get to where you want to be from here and the roadmap, but in getting there, are there different leverage or pain points that you can bring to bear on the issue to ensure it moves forward? And if so, what are those pieces of leverage that you'd like to, or that you've identified that you can bring to bear on making progress?
Okay, thank you. Let's go to Minky.
Yep. This is a related question, and I also want to report some impact. And Andreas, you referenced that you'd observed Semyon Simonev's trial. One of the consequences of that is that the just chokehold that the state security had on him and his organization, which had been delisted, was actually, his organization has been made legal again. He announced it recently. So you don't really know your power until you actually try. And it was a big deal to go to Volgograd, and we appreciate that at Human Rights Watch, but then you don't really know what the knock-on effects are. So you may have saved his life down the line. So I wanted to say also that the work of the Human Rights Advisory Board has been exemplary. The report and the response, you're getting to the point where you're fulfilling the transparency obligation of the UN Guiding Principles. I also wanted to say the leverage point. There needs to be some leverage on Hakim Al-Arabi, the Bahraini player who's in prison and certain to be deported absent action from FIFA. Finally, on the women's stadium problem, this has been around for 40 years. It has, as your own report pointed out, it's been since 2004 that non-discrimination has been in the statutes. And the FIFA Human Rights Advisory Board had very clear recommendations, and they were a deadline and sanctions. So I wanted one question to you, Andreas. When is the deadline, and what are the sanctions? The second question to Maryam, you've been advised to file a FIFA ethics report, and I'd like you to talk about that. I want, you began, Andreas, with the leverage point and the importance of working with defenders, but you must recognize, FIFA must recognize that defenders take enormous risk to do something like file a report. So we can't ask defenders to do things that will jeopardize themselves when it's a prima facie violation of FIFA statute Article 4. Thank you.
Thanks for that. We had a question just here.
Hello. My name's Sally. I'm with the organization Wrestle Like a Girl. This is for Maryam. Iran is starting to grow their sporting opportunities for female wrestlers, and they've been asking our organization to go in and continue to support. And I'm also aware that there was a female that gained entry into a stadium for participation for a World Cup. And my question for you is, have you reached out to any other international federations like United World Wrestling to seek and attain their support, knowing that multiple stakeholders, in addition to FIFA and, of course, the IOC, can be utilized to advance this cause? And if not, I would like to help you.
Okay, great. Thanks for the offer. There was a gentleman just here who had a question.
Hello, my name is Konrad Rehling from Südwind, a human rights NGO in Austria. I'd like to turn to you, Maryam, and maybe also to you, Lene, about now using this whole network, talking about your very important sample case in Iran, acting as a human rights defender, whether on the one hand addressing FIFA directly, trying to use their leverage, public awareness and so on, but on the other hand also trying to use the instrument the UN Human Rights Council offers for human rights defenders to speak up and in parallel, promote cases like these on the UN HRC level. Question is, have you been starting these issues already, these things, and what you think now using this network could help to work on different levels? Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Federica, your statement, can it wait? Can you use other... Yeah, great, okay, because we're short for time. Now, can I ask you to just very quickly answer some of the questions?
I'm sorry, you asked a question, but I need to answer. This is an exact example of gender discrimination. And gender discrimination consequences is completely obvious. They have to be excluded. And we have been waiting enough. I think 40 years is more than enough. And the only thing that at this point FIFA has to do is giving them a deadline, public it. I mean, it has to be published on their website or their social media, whatever. They have to announce it publicly, give him a deadline. And at this point, I think the only way that this issue can be solved at this point is Mr. Infantino himself. Because other part of FIFA, they were working with us. They were like, I know that they want this to be changed, but my point is, because nobody, even the president of Iran, 2 months ago came and he said, why we don't let Iranian women come to stadium? He wants Iranian women to come to stadium, but he doesn't have that much power. At this point, Mr. Infantino, who is praising Iranian authority to keeping their word, is the only one. And the election is coming. If that doesn't change, know that Mr. Infantino doesn't want to do that. That's the only thing that I can do. Because this is an issue that has to be solved. And the only one that can put pressure is Mr. Infantino.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. Andreas, so I think actually Mary's question and Miki's question on Iran kind of syncs together. The leverage is your ability to sanction. Now we see bans, temporary, usually until FA sort themselves out for all sorts of issues. what is the deadline? What's the time frame? What are the next steps? And it needs really to be a clear roadmap.
I'll try to give as brief an answer as possible. Well, what are the leverage points? One leverage point is events. You know, Iran did bid for the 2020 Futsal World Cup, and it was one of the first events we assessed also under a human rights criterion. They did not get it. Article 4 was mentioned. So Article 4 says, in terms of sanctions, yes, suspension or expulsion. Now, under the statutes, the decision for a suspension or an expulsion is either the FIFA Council or the FIFA Congress. So it is a political decision in the end.
Can I just very quickly? Were they told that they didn't get the futsal tournament because of the ban on women? Were they informed of that?
I did not say that they did not get it because of the ban on women.
Well, you mentioned it in the context, so I think we assumed that quite rightly.
Yeah, it was part of the assessment. Okay. And just very briefly to Minka's question, what is the deadline? What was the sanction? There's currently no deadline. So far, FIFA's approach has very much been to engage, to have a diplomatic approach, to be inclusive. We're constantly reassessing the effectiveness of all our human rights work, including on this topic. But I cannot announce anything that is not discussed. But I will also not take anything off the table.
Okay, thanks very much, Lene. Can you come in?
Yeah, just quickly, just to understand your question, were you talking about the role of the centre in using human rights mechanisms, or in terms of individual human rights defenders that have been at risk? Both. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think certainly as one of maybe several avenues, because international mechanisms can be very important, but they have their own, they have their strengths and limitations, and certainly for individual cases, I think one could try to map out in a particular case which would be the appropriate, depending on the issue, depending on the country involved, depending on where their ratification of what treaties. I certainly think that should be something that for human rights defenders can and should be considered. There's also, again, depending on the issue, the kind of attention that could come from special rapporteurs, the independent experts that can issue reports, etc. So I think in terms of a human rights defender strategy, that certainly these mechanisms can be utilized. Again, probably not on their own. It would be part of maybe a broader campaign, but that I would certainly encourage. There's also, in terms of the role of the center, maybe more systematically, one could imagine, for example, that where there are host countries that have been awarded a big game, that the center would do a shadow report, for example, to bring to the attention of the issues related to sport into the deliberations of the Universal Peer Review, for example, or when there are specific treaty reporting obligations that touch on or is related to some of the particular salient human rights issues in a given country that's organizing an event. That could be another opportunity. I think it is something we have discussed over the years in terms of what potential role the center could use of international sort of information from international instruments or mechanisms, but also, of course, how the center could be feeding into the work and the knowledge base that these mechanisms use in doing their work.
Okay, thank you very much.
And very briefly, two things. One, the European Olympic Games will be held in Belarus. The previous one was held in Azerbaijan. Both are incredibly repressive countries for journalists and human rights defenders, and so it's imperative that the EOC adopt a mechanism. It really can't wait. There are two good templates out there. There shouldn't be any excuse. I don't know if they're here, but I would love to engage with them. And frankly, the OHCHR also has a case reporting mechanism now, so I'll just end with that.
That's great. I think we need to finish, really. We're way over time. Go on then, very quickly.
After the meeting I had with the Secretary General, I wrote, it was a month ago, I wrote a complaint, an ethnic complaint, sent it to FIFA 4 days ago. So we are waiting, and that's the last step that we can take.
Thank you very much. Can you please thank this panel for a great debate and insights?